let's see.
Right there.
Oh, right here?
Right
Oh.
there. We'll get you learned on how to teach a class again.
All right, let's keep going.
You probably leave the back one on.
So that we can see, so the people watching from home can see.
All right, so this is William Smith, Chapter 2. When we last left our intrepid hero, he had grown up in Churchill in Oxfordshire, was orphaned, was employed because of his interest in surveying by Edward Webb, Stowe and the Wold, and went to work with him, and then was successful enough that at a fairly young age, still in his late teens, Edward Webb sent him off to an area just south and west of Bath, England, to survey Lady Jones of Ramsbury, newly acquired properties there. And while he was doing that, he lived at Rugbourne Farm, and he became familiar with the stratigraphy in the coal mines around High Littleton where he lived. He also then was conscripted or hired as the surveyor and then later engineer for the canals that would carry the coal from the Somersetshire coal fields to the big cities. And so when we last were talking about William Smith, we saw that he developed the lithostratigraphic subdivision of the area in southwestern England, and that he had also paid really close attention to the fossils that occurred in each of these number of strata that he had defined. And so he gave us the concept of naming lithostratigraphic units. He also developed the law of faunal succession, which has been used by countless generations of geologists ever since. So down here we see a picture of the fossils that he worked on from the lower chalk. We see what's left of the coal canal on the far east end of the Somerset Canal. And we'll move on to some of these other discoveries and some of the other events that took place in William Smith's life for today. So let's move on to geological mapping. So before we do that, just want to remind you that William Smith lived at Rugbourne Farm initially, a place that we'll visit. Then he stayed in a property on the outskirts of the southern part of Bath. And then he bought this property along the canal that we spoke of last time, and up on the hill. You'll recall that he opened up a quarry in the inferior oolite, hoping to sell that as building stone. But an economic crash in London and the fact that the stone that he had on his property was not very good for construction, he lost his shirt on that particular endeavor. But he continued to owe and pay on his mortgage for the Tucking Mill Cottage, and that mortgage was held by Sir Conley at Midford Castle, which was just a few miles up the canal to the east from Tucking Mill. So he had this property. He owned it from 1798 to about 1818, but seldom lived there. Oh, one final thing. But one thing that he did set up here, he had constructed sets of shelves that would allow him to display his fossils in the order in which they laid in the earth. So people could come here and visit, and he would very graciously and enthusiastically walk you through and say, these are from this formation, these are from this, and here's how they lie in the earth.
Why are there no windows on the south side of that cottage? Is that normal?
Did not have windows?
Well, tonight, so the whole south side where it's all, just don't have that, they just.
Yeah,
they
yeah. Sort of an ugly, I mean, it's
Yeah.
not that, I can see why they put the plaque on the other one. I mean, it's a
Yeah.
little,
I mean, Rugbourne Farm's nothing to look at.
Yeah. Good question. So his fossils were there. Now remember, he had been fired from the coal company, or the canal company, because he was trying to piggyback putting together a quarry that, and the stone would have been shipped down the canal. So they didn't take very kindly that, so he was fired in 1798. And for the rest of his life, for the rest of his days, he never had a full-time employment. He was essentially what we would call a consulting geologist or consultant for the rest of his days. He went into business for a few years, from 1802 to 1805. He went into business with a man named Jeremiah Cruz, and they opened up a surveying business, and this was the headquarters for that business on Trimbridge Street, or Trim Street, near Trimbridge in Bath. So as we hike around Bath, we'll have a chance to go by and take a look at this spot. Almost immediately upon moving into or renting these quarters and opening up the business, William Smith had some folks take all the fossils out of his cabinets, take the cabinets to the Trimbridge shop, set the cabinets back up, and once again put the fossils in the order in which they lay in the earth. That was a huge thing to him. So then people that were interested, or people coming in to have them to contract with them to do work, would be able to see these fossils. Now, what was the work they would do? A lot of it was surveying. A lot of it was also just draining fields, putting up coastal defenses along the ocean, and doing what we would currently refer to as hydrogeologic work or geological engineering. So that was a lot of the work that they did. And they made, a fairly decent salary.
Why do they have 6 of those windows bricked up there?
So you don't have to pay as much taxes, I suppose.
Yeah, bad tradition, brick it all up.
So I don't know, Jeremiah Cruz probably felt like a lot of the work was falling on him because William Smith had other things that he was trying to accomplish. And in 1799, Taylor and Naylor published a book called The Historical and Local New Bath Guide. And in this book, they published a map with Bath in the middle of it, 5 miles diameter, and for some reason, it's kind of unusual, made the map circular. So we could just see within the purview of that circle, the area around Bath. So we can see the Avon River heading over towards the Bristol Channel, Willowbrook and Cambrook down in the southern part of this. So here is where that first canal was built, and the second meet at Mitford, and then on to the Kennet, and then the Kennet-Avon Canal and the Avon River. So William Smith, again, remember they filleted open the countryside, and he studied every stratum as it went up section from west to east, and was going to have to repeat that over here. And so in his mind, he said, if I know the attitude of a layer here, I can project in my mind's eye the trajectory of that across the countryside and predict where it should show up on the next river over. And if I can do it for there, I should be able to do it across this whole area and across the entirety of the British countryside. So using this as his base map, William Smith produced the first geological map. And so this was in 1799. So here's the Avon River running through. And at the time, in this area, he was most familiar with 3 different formations: the Red Marl, Triassic Age, the Jurassic Blue Lias, and the Middle Jurassic Inferior Oolite. It's red, bluish, and yellowish in color, so you can see what inspired him to color the map the way he did. The contacts between the formations are right along the base of the blue here and along the base of the yellow. On a modern geological map of the area, all of the area between this contact and this contact would be covered blue, and that would be the surface expression of the blue lias. This would all be covered in yellow and show the distribution at the surface of the oolite. All of this down here would be colored in red and show the disposition of the Triassic beds. But William Smith, to give it sort of a three-dimensional feel, colored the basal contact the deepest color, and then it faded to a lighter color of blue until you got to the base of this, and that would fade into a lighter color of yellow and so on. So this was the first geological map, as far as we can tell, that was,
Do you
How
call
big
it a
is that?
geologic map? What
Produced.
would you call it?
say what?
What would you call it? Like, did he call it a geologic map?
Yeah.
or-
Yeah, or a map of the underside of the country, or the delineation of strata across the country, but yeah, it was basically a geologic
Was
map.
it printed? Self-printed?
Was this printed?
Yeah.
No, this was just hand colored. He was just sitting at his table and saying, okay, I should be able to figure out where these strata are.
It wasn't included with that, map?
That book? No. He simply took that map and put his colors over top of it. So here's a little different view of that. This is the property of the Geological Society of London. One of the originals was also in the Bath Royal Literary Society there in Bath. But anyway, so there it is, first geological map. In addition to people being interested in coal and in soils and in metals and so on, there was a lot of developments going on in the realm of agriculture. And a lot of that required that someone go into these farmlands and pasture lands and drain excess water out. So William Smith got quite a reputation as a drainer and was invited to the farms of many of the landed gentry and got to know a number of influential people. And the Duke of Bedford every year hosted what was called a sheep shearing at his estate at Woburn. Here is a sketch or a painting that was done by George Garrard showing the people that were in attendance at the Woburn sheep shearing in 1804. William Smith is in there somewhere. I can't remember where he is, but there's a key to this. It's a sketch that just shows the outline silhouette of the people, and they're all numbered, and then there's a big key that shows who all of those people are. So that's quite an undertaking to get all those people in there, plus you had to show the animals, which were the stars of the shows, and some of these different types of cattle were just being bred for the first time. Crops were being introduced and modified. Here's another colored image of a portion of that. And again, I don't see William Smith, but one of the important people shown here, however, is Sir Joseph Banks. And where you do see William Smith, and he's listed on that legend of attendees, it says William Smith, and it gives him the label of drainer. So that's what he was known for. That was his forte at that time. And that is certainly not a demeaning term. There were just all sorts of landowners who, to maximize their property for agriculture and for other things, really needed to manage the water. So here is Sir Joseph Banks, who is figured prominently sitting there in an important place. Sir Joseph Banks went around the world with Captain James Cook, and he collected thousands of types of plants, and he named 1,400 new plant species from his work there. He was also the president of the Royal Society, which was the elite, the premier scientific society in the world. and certainly in London, but if it was in London, it meant certainly in the world. And that august body would meet at Somerset House. When we go out these doors right here, we will end up on the Strand, and I'll show you where that is on a map a little bit later. But that runs essentially east-west, and if we stand here and turn around 180 degrees, we see another building that looks essentially like this to the south, and that is the Admiralty Building. And if you go on to the other side of that, there's the Thames River. So this was right down on the Strand, very wealthy area, very important area of London at the time, and it still is. And Sir Joseph Banks was the president of the Royal Society for many, many, many years. Well, he met William Smith at the Woburn sheep shearing and was shown some of the work that he was doing on a map. That interested Sir Joseph Banks greatly. So he gave William Smith several pounds, 50 pounds or something like that, with the anticipation that that sponsorship would produce this long promised map, and it would produce it fairly quickly. This is in 1804. The map doesn't surface till 1815.
So 50 pounds to do the whole map of Britain.
Whole map of Britain. Right, because Smith was sort of talking up the stuff that he'd done, was talking about publishing on the distribution of fossils, the stratigraphy. Problem is, William Smith was not a very good writer, at least not a very confident writer. Plus, he was very busy with draining swamps, with traveling. Sometimes he'd put in 10,000 miles a year going and traveling to different job sites or out trying to find new exposures of fossils and strata in support of the map that he was putting together. So you can imagine, you as a single person, unemployed, as of 1808 or 1807, you now have a wife named Mary Ann and a young nephew who is orphaned that has come to stay with you. You're trying to do enough consulting to keep your head above water, and you're trying to, all by yourself, map an entire country for the first time. So a lot on his plate, a lot on his hands, a lot on his mind. So Sir Joseph Banks sort of comes to the rescue at that point and makes him feel like, hey, maybe there is something here. Maybe I'm going to start getting the recognition that I feel like I deserve. William Smith's nephew, who came to stay with him, John Phillips, in the biography that he wrote, said, Smith suffered from the habit of procrastination, which had resisted the ambition of scientific fame. So William Smith knew what he had and how important it was, but he just wasn't very good at getting things published or fulfilling promises to people like Sir Joseph Banks of the final product, the end product. And so, however, because of the pat on the back from Sir Joseph Banks and some money up front, William Smith decided that it was important for him to move to London. So he looked around, found a place down. Here's the Strand running through here. I'll have a map. I think I have a map that's not covered with stuff here in a minute. But the Strand runs here along the north bank of the Thames. This is an area known as the Adelphi, and it was built by some brothers, and Adelphi means the brothers. And down here on Buckingham Street goes from the Strand right down at the time to the Thames River, and right there on the end of it, in what is now, it looked like this, and it's unfortunate that the original building's been torn down and have that ugly white building in its place. But that was number 15 Buckingham Street. And William Smith had that property, rented it from 1803 to 1819. So even though he had tucking mill, he seldom stayed there. Immediately upon getting this property, what do you think he did first? Got the cabinets and fossils in the dining room. He didn't have much furniture in here, but he set up the fossils again. And then on the floor, he would work on his maps. Interestingly enough, in this very same place was occupied by Charles Dickens for a period of time. So here is the Strand. This is Somerset House, where the Royal Society and the Admiralty buildings were. Here is the home on Buckingham Street. Well, that's a Darwin thing, we'll get that later. This is approximately the point where John Carey, the person who made William Smith's maps, had his shop. This is where on Queen Street, this was the location of the Masonic Tavern or Masonic Temple. And the reason that's important because in 1807, that's where the Geological Society of London started and first housed itself and held its meetings. And then this is a position of the King's Bench Prison, which William Smith would end up in for a while in 1819.
Would it be cheaper lodging by the river just because that's where all the sewage went, it smelled bad and whatnot?
No, it was pretty expensive. It was in a really nice part of town. But the reason for that, he was trying to wine and dine. You know, he was a poor country kid who didn't have much respect or didn't get much respect. And so he was trying to buy his way in a way into high society by at least having the appearance of, you know, so if people were going to come visit, they weren't coming to some hovel somewhere. This is a sketch of the Freemasons Tavern, whereupon in November 13th of 1807, at a dinner that was attended by these gentlemen, the Geological Society of London came into existence. And it is one of the august geological societies in the UK or globally to this day. And the idea was, or the purpose behind it was, that there be forthwith instituted a geological society for the purpose of making geologists acquainted with each other, of stimulating their zeal, of inducing them to adopt one nomenclature, of facilitating the communications of new facts, and of ascertaining what is known in their science, what remains to be discovered. Each of the original 13 founding members were pretty well off. The leader, the first director, first president of the society was George Bellas Greenough. And here's the sketch of George Bellas Greenough when he was somewhere in his 20s. He was born George Bellas, but his grandfather, who I can't remember his first name, his last name was Greenough, made a ton of money. And the money came from the sale of Greenough's liver pills. And these were touted as being able to cure anything from chronic flatulence to depression to anything in between. So these things were just flying off the shelf, and his grandfather Greenough became, in modern, a millionaire. Okay? Now his grandson, George Bellas, was going to Eton, which is a school for, right, isn't that where the royals go to school and so on and so forth? Well, his grandfather died while he was at school, and he then stood in line to inherit a lot of money, but the stipulation was that he would take the Greenough name. And so from that point on, it was George Bellas Greenough, and he was a very wealthy individual who was a geological hobbyist, if you will. So this was a group of people that would get together and it'd be a dinner club. They'd go to fine restaurants, and it was upper class people. They didn't let women in initially. They didn't let lower class people in, and they certainly didn't let William Smith in.
Does he have the credentials or didn't have the money? What was?
Neither.
Did he try?
You had to receive a letter of invitation. And he certainly had the credentials to do it. But he didn't marry well enough. He was lower class. So the social stratification was a huge impediment. Well, in the spring of 1808, William Smith, he was acquainted with Arthur Aiken from the canal building days. And Arthur Aiken kept apprised of what William Smith was working on. And it was probably Arthur Aiken that suggested or convinced James Hall and some of the other early members of the club to go visit William Smith. And so in the spring of 1808, and they actually left from the Parliament building because he was a Parliament minister, they took a field trip to William Smith's home there on Buckingham Street, knocked on the door. Mrs. Kitten, who was his maid there, let them in. He took them on a quick tour, showed them his fossils, and he said James Hall looked them over and over and couldn't find anything that really seemed to interest him. They looked at his maps and stratigraphic charts, sort of turned their noses up at him, and after a short period left, and he was, in his journals, writes how disappointed he was and how upset he was with this hoity-toity group of people and looking down their nose at him. And so they left, and he got nothing out of it except feeling further snubbed and further devalued. But somewhere on the trip back to Parliament, in their carriage, it's suspected that they decided that, well, we're the Geological Society, we need to make a map of England. And so they started to make their own map of England, which would be published in 1820.
Like they looked at his map and decided they liked it?
Yeah.
He showed him the map that he had up to that point. And so it's pretty well conceded now that they did a lot of plagiarism.
Because he didn't do his for another 7 years, right?
Correct, but there was a fellow named John Ferry who was the Duke of Bedford's land steward, and he did some surveys of some of the counties with William Smith, knew what William Smith did, saw the techniques he employed, had some of his papers and some of the maps that he helped him make. And it wasn't long before Greenough came to him and said, we need some help here, we're not succeeding very well. Well, one of the problems was Smith had a procedure, he had a plan, he had a talisman in his tool bag, and that was he knew which fossils defined different strata, and he had a complete view of the stratigraphic succession. So he was tracing well-defined units across the land. Greenough said, we're going to take a very objective approach, we're only going to we'll go a place, we'll map what we see, we're not going to be influenced by Smith's strata or anything like that. Now can you imagine doing that, ignoring those data? So they ran into trouble pretty early on, so they got John Ferry to come in, and then they took his maps. In Greenoff's collections, there are no fewer than 4 of William Smith's maps that came out in 1815, and on different sheets it said this sheet is no longer of any value to us, meaning they'd already copied everything off of it that they needed to, right? Here's how they would do field work. They would, before they went to an area of England to map, Greenough and others would read all the papers that had been written. Then they would send advance flyers to anybody, farmers, mole catchers, canal digger, anybody who might have anything to do with the land, and they would set up interviews. Then they would go to the nicest hotel in town, and all these people would come through and they would interview them and take notes about what they said, and that's how they did their field work. Then if, as a last resort, they may go out and look at chips and rocks.
So did they have ordnance survey maps as a base to draw this on, or were they doing raw maps from nothing?
Yeah, it wasn't until later that John Carey came to William Smith in about 1812 said, look, I understand you're sort of down on your luck. Let's get this going. I will draw the base map for you. And that's really what spurred him to continue. But at the same time, you know, he had competition now from the members of the Geological Society of London. On March 15th, 1815, William Smith left his home on Buckingham Street, walked up the Strand, and as he went past the bowed windows of John Carey, the mapmaker's store, he saw 4 colored completed sheets of the geological map that he was making. And one of them was this sheet that had the area where it all started. Here are the 2 canals right here, here's Bath. So it had the geology of the sheet around Bath. He was really excited about that. Carey wanted him to be excited. Didn't tell him ahead of time, you know. He just, when he walked by, you know, when he sees it, he'll see it. So he ran in and said, can I borrow some of these? And he immediately headed down to Somerset House to show Sir Joseph Banks. Because Banks was getting a little bit fed up with the fact that he'd given him money as early as 1804. And here in 1815, the map still had not come out. Sir Joseph Banks had essentially given up on him. And so he wanted to get back in the good graces of the president of the Royal Society, not a bad move. So he hurried over as fast as he could with the sheets, and Joseph Banks was exultant, thought these are absolutely beautiful. And so that put him back in his good graces. And then later, in April 1815, William Smith was invited to the Art Society's annual meeting to give a talk, of all things, about his map, to show off. He had now, essentially the whole map. Gave a talk about the fossils and the strata and how he made the map. And he was very, very well received. So this was, a really, highlight. Second one. So in March he got to go and show his map off to the president of the Royal Society. Then he got to go to the Art Society and show off his map and get accolades. Plus, 10 years before, this society had said anybody who produces a map of a mineral map of England, we will give them 50 pounds. So he collected that money. And so that, which helped a lot. And then on August 1st of 1815, the maps were completely done. So John Carey had put together the base map, and then William Smith would take those sheets and on the floor of his Buckingham Street home would painstakingly draw the contacts and then color in the contacts. Each one of these was hand colored.
One question on the base map. So somebody had already surveyed, proper distances.
Correct.
With all the projection and all that.
Correct, and the base topography and the rivers and so on, yeah. And then William Smith laid the geology over that. So all these labels and the water here and the labels and the roads and so on, that was all John Carey. And then the color on top of it and the contacts, the geology was William Smith. So there it is, the 1815 map. It was 9 feet tall by 6.5 feet wide and came on several sheets. And if you wanted to buy one of these, you could subscribe, and a number of people did, and you could get just a leather pouch that had all the individual sheets, or you could get them where they're mounted. You could get different flavors that would range from 7 pounds up to 20 pounds. Here's the title, a delineation of, you're asking about what did he call it? He called it the delineation of the strata of England and Wales and part of Scotland. The collieries and mines, the marshes and fenlands originally overflowed by the sea, and the varieties of soils according to variations in the substrate. So quite a title, and you can tell that he did a lot of work. It wasn't just here are the formations, it was everything.
Overflowed by the sea because he's finding marine fossils.
Yeah. He asked on that trip to to see Joseph Banks and show him those original sheets, he asked if he could dedicate the map to him. And so he graciously dedicated the map to Sir Joseph Banks, who was really his first sponsor. So this is the 1815 map.
So what do they charge for a copy?
About £7. And he would get 25 shillings from each copy sold. They originally did 40 of the 1815 map, and I guess the Geological Society of London has 4 of them.
Is that one of the ones that hangs?
Yeah. One of the original ones of the 40 is the one that hangs there. In fact, there it is right there.
Pardon,
7 pounds.
40 maps made.
yeah, about £7 at the time would be hundreds of dollars a day.
Oh, yeah, it would
Probably
be.
more like 1,000.
Yeah,
It's a big map, Riley, come on.
9 feet tall,
I mean. you
But
could-
as there are a few hanging around, as you can imagine, they sell for a lot of money. Probably $30,000 or $40,000 now, if you want the originals.
Should we buy one for the department?
Yeah, we should do that. So here's the legend, and he had to do each of these by hand. So here's the stratigraphy that he'd been working on now for 20 years.
Scott, I read that some folks criticize some of the names he used formations.
Yeah, well, there's like the clunch clay, right? That's sort of the corn brash, and so a lot of these names have fallen out of favor, but a lot of them are the same.
$630.
Old fans, I guess. A lot of their guys.
Do any of those formation names, they stick, or have they all been replaced?
No, some of them have. Some of them have. A lot have been replaced. Here's another part of the legend. Shows the canals, tunnels, railroads, collieries, lead mines, copper deposits, tin deposits, salt and alum works. So it's pretty comprehensive.
There's no system yet that he's breaking the strata into, Jurassic.
No.
No,
No.
just formations.
No, that one till a little bit later. And then, like a good geological map today, has cross sections to go with it. So William Smith did cross sections. So here's from Wales down to London. A little stylized. Of course, the stratigraphy in Wales is a little more complex than that. But for the secondary rocks, or the Mesozoic, Cenozoic, pretty much the way they lay underground. So just beautiful set of maps. I mean, it's art, really. I mean, in a way, it's art. The AAPG was selling these cross sections. I think you can still order them from AAPG.
Is William Smith gonna be part of that?
So, as you walk into, or as if they'll let us in, we'll come in off of the main street through this door, through this little entryway. Here's one of William Smith's original 1815 maps. Here is the 1820 Geological Society of London map. And here's George Bellas Greenough, and here's William Smith. So they have these side by side. Starting in 1865 or somewhere in there, they started putting on here that it's after the work of William Smith. So they, at least after several decades, acknowledged the fact that they had taken a lot of his information
So
originally.
they weren't breaking it apart by strata, what did they map? What were their mapping units?
They came around to doing that. They just say, here's a limestone, here's a sandstone, here's a this, and we'll just, we're gonna map what we see, which is just ridiculous. So when Greenough was asked why they look so similar, he said, well, because they're both right. The difference is, here's an army of people working on this, plus all the people they conscripted when they got to the areas.
Plus all the financing.
And the financing, this is the work of one person who walked tens of thousands of miles and funded it all on his own, except for maybe 50 pounds from a few people here and there.
So do his notes, he had to be taking notes as he went along, does that also exist, or is that all gone?
Yeah, whenever he was traveling with someone, much to their annoyance, he'd be jumping off the coach and going, grabbing this and grabbing that. one of the effects of this map was that people knew that this was coming along, and they thought, well, I thought I'd bought this map, I don't want to pay for this map, so they would they want the money back for their prescription for it. And so, and when this came out, they purposefully made it less money than William Smith's map. So he basically lost money on the production of the map, or didn't get the money that he was hoping for.
They sold like 6 pounds, or what did they do? How much was to buy there?
Six pounds
$6.99.
instead of 7. And then if you were a member of this or a member of that, then it was 4 pounds or 3 pounds, so they undercut him.
I mean, they did the same projection, like they both go up to
Yeah,
the Scottish lowlands and.
yeah. Anyway, as far as I'm concerned, yeah, boo, right? Boo. So here are the two maps side by side, the 1819 Geological Society map, William Smith's 1815 map. You'll notice that no geology in adjacent Ireland or on the continent.
Does one have more hard rock geology than the other?
Hard rock? I don't think so. Not that you can tell. This is the Geological Survey map of 1912. So the British Geological, so we have Geological Society London map, William Smith's map, now we have the British Ordnance map, the Geological Survey, which is the official map, I guess.
100 years later.
Yeah. So you would think this would be a great time in Smith's life. The map is published, starting to get a little bit of recognition, but this was a time where things were going spectacularly bad for him. He had the Faildew-like quarry. His wife, Mary Ann, was going insane and had both physical and mental problems. He had to take care of his orphan nephew. He had a mortgage on the Tucking Mill house in Bath. He had to pay for his 5-story flat in Buckingham Lane in London. He was always traveling and had field expenses, plus the gentlemanly plagiarism that started in 1808. Income was subscriptions for the map, surveying and draining. Income minus expenses equals prison. Okay? During this time, there was what Simon Winchester refers to in his book as the sale of the century. He went to the British Museum and said, "Would you buy my specimens? I need money." So he had 2,657 specimens that he sold in 1818 to the British government for 650 pounds. He was hoping to get at least 3 times that much. And he had to carry him there and all the cabinets with it. Here's a book that came out last year. I'm still waiting to get a copy of it, called William Smith's Fossils Reunited, Straight Identified. So it'd be interesting to see. Hopefully they'll have some actual images of the specimens and so on.
Because we're not important enough to go see them.
Yeah, right. They wouldn't let us in last anyway. They used to have them on display a long time ago. Now they've been just gathering dust in museum drawers for the last century or 2.
And they're in Somerset House, or where are they at? The fossils?
They're in the
Natural
British
History
Museum, Natural History. On June 11th, 1819, creditors finally caught up with William Smith, and the constable showed up and said, "You're going to debtor's prison." So they went along the Strand, across Blackfriars Bridge, and down to the King's Bench prison. And he was there for 11 weeks. And this seems kind of stupid. If you can't pay your debts, we throw you in prison where you can't generate any more money. But at least we own your body, I guess, or something. So he was there for 11 weeks, and when Lord Mitford finally relented on the mortgage, he was let out of jail.
And this is on the mortgage on his house out in Bath.
Yeah, he tried to get out of that a number of times, and Connolly wouldn't let him out of it. So from June 11th, 1819 to August 31st, 1819, he was in King's Bench Prison. And it had high walls all around it, and apparently legend has it, this is where racquetball, just because they were bored trying to, competitive people, and racquetball came up. So he gets out of jail. As you can imagine, he's really sort of disenchanted with everything in London, and he and his wife and nephew get on the stage and head up to Scarborough. And there he is employed and becomes the land steward for Sir John Johnstone, and this is the Hackness estate. And so he and his family are given a place to live, and then he does draining and does other work for John Johnstone, Lord Johnstone, and then other people around there. Johnston knows who this man is, and so here's the 1815 map. William Smith continued to work on it. Here's an 1820 map, and now you can see some of the geology of adjacent areas in there. And then here's an 1828 version of the map. So he continued to work on it. Plus there are the county maps that he put together, and you can get these at the British Museum gift shop if you're interested in those. So anyway, off to Scarborough. And Sir John Johnston's interested in natural history, and so he has William Smith help him design a museum that would be suitable for showing the fossils and rocks from Scarborough in Yorkshire. And that becomes the Rotund Museum, or Rotunda Museum. And here's what it looks like today. The wings have been added since William Smith's time, but William Smith and his nephew helped design the inside. And these are redesigned now, but it had shelves in rows, and guess what he had on those shelves? His fossils in the order which they came from the earth. He's not going to give up on that. His
Where did he get new fossils? Like, he sold all those fossils, right?
What?
Whose fossils were these?
They were fossils from the Jurassic Coast.
Oh, okay, so
Okay.
new fossils, because he sold all his, right?
Right, he sold his, so he had these collections that he pulled together. And then his nephew painted around. So if you're standing down here on the main ground, you can see the glass display cases, and up around this level, you can see a cross section or the vista of the strata that you see along the coast near Scarborough. And this is Fossil Day in Scarborough in 2019. So I've got all these people out looking at Jurassic fossils along the coast. And then we'll finish up, we've only got a couple seconds left, so let's finish up this way. Finally, in 1831, the Geological Society, again, that started in 1807, never asked Smith to join, purloined his map, bought his fossils for a song. Finally, they decide that they should give him his due. So in the summer of 1831, the president of the Geological Society of London, who is at the time Adam Sedgwick, they decide that they will give the highest honor that can be bestowed upon by that society, the Wollaston Medal. They will give it to William Smith, kind of make up for some of the past bad feelings. And this is from his lecture or his eulogy. I, for one, can speak with gratitude of the practical lessons I've received from Mr. Smith. It was by tracking his footsteps with his maps in my hand through Wiltshire and neighboring countries where he had trodden nearly 30 years before that I first learned the subdivision of the Oolitic series and on and on. And in that speech at the Geological Society in London, he says he thereby dubs William Smith the father of British geology. And that's a name that stuck with him. It wasn't until the following year, so round buildings seem to be something important to him later in life. This is the Sheldonian Theatre at Oxford, and it was here at the second annual meeting of the British Association for the Advancement of Science in June of 1832 that William Smith was actually given the Wollaston Medal. He'd received the £1,400 award the year before. So here's the inside of the Sheldonian. You can imagine William Smith being invited up here by Adam Sedgwick to receive the first Wollaston Medal. Wollaston was a chemist and a physicist. He discovered palladium and rhodium. The original 5 or 6 medals were gold, but ever since then they're made of palladium. And on the front is the bust of Wollaston, and on the back says Geological Society of London, and then it has the name of the recipient. In 1839, so 7 years later, William Smith was traveling, and he's now in his late 60s. He was traveling on his way to Birmingham to go to the BAAS meeting for that year. And he'd been out puttering around in the cold and he caught pneumonia. And so on his way to the meeting, he had to stop off at a friend's house in Northampton. And he just continued to go downhill. And a day or so later, on August 28, 1839, he passed away at the age of 69 from that pneumonia that he had caught. This is where the mortal remains of William Smith currently rest, outside of outside of St. Mary's Church, or St. Peter's Church in Mayfair, and hopefully we'll have a chance to stop here. And if you go to the pub that's just right behind these trees,
If the pub is open.
they will give you a big key and you can go let yourself in the church, and inside the entrance to the church is this marble bust of William Smith, and it says some nice things about him. But this is where he was laid to rest. And then James Secord, who's a British geologist writer, said, "Those practitioners able to combine a range of disciplines under a new analytical order and apply them on a global scale are most admired." So if that's the case, I think William Smith certainly fits that bill, and I don't have any problem referring to him as the father of English geology. So anyway, there's some William Smith trivia and some William Smith sites and some of the things that hopefully will inform our travels over there. So keep reading. You know, read. The more you